Hey listeners, our show is now available on Google Play Music. Download the Google Play Music app on your smartphone or go to play.google.com/music and search for us, the 1P versus 2P podcast, to stream and subscribe to our episodes. Check it out. Homefront: The Revolution releases to little fanfare. Civilization 6 returns for just one more turn. And GG to Dreamloop Games for making their game more accessible to a gamer who simply asked. All that plus more today, Wednesday, May 18th, 2016. You're listening to the 1P versus 2P podcast. I'm Taylor Ray. With me, as always, is my brother and co-host, Ryan Ray. Let's begin with our top stories from this past week in gaming. Let's begin with this very weird story that we saw posted on Kotaku about a strange review posted by the Washington Post on Uncharted 4: A Thief's End, which, if you're listening to our show, you know was released last week to a lot of critical acclaim out there. Right now, the Metacritic score sits at a 93, which is superb, excellent. It's received a lot of perfect or near perfect scores from a lot of different outlets. What made this review interesting is that this guy, his name is Michael Thompson, and what's interesting is that this article that he posted, this review on Uncharted 4, did not assign a review score. And what happened was when this review was submitted to Metacritic, there was no score given, and someone from the Washington Post assigned it a 4 out of 10 out of nowhere. So Ryan, what's going on here? What's sort of the reaction to this?
Yeah, the response to this really negative outlier review was very harsh. There was even a Change.org petition that was signed by just over 4,000 petitioners, including a probably most famous signer, popular voice actor Troy Baker, who is co-stars and is a major voice in the newest Uncharted game. The goal of the petition was to try to remove the Washington Post Metacritic score from the overall ratings so that it wouldn't affect the overall average. It just reads like a really bad internet flame war of old. People getting really, really angry over a review score. And it just brings up all this stuff, again, that makes us question the value of game reviews, the value of groupthink. You know, I think it's important for people like us, people who are game critics, people who are players, to really take a grain of salt when it comes to games reviews. And consider that not everybody's going to have the same experience. Not everybody's going to come with the same kind of background. Just because one reviewer likes the game and another reviewer didn't really find it so appealing, it doesn't mean that the game is necessarily always good or always bad. You know, we've kind of assumed that when we say a game is a game of the year, that means it's a universal truth. And that's just not always the case. Not everybody's going to be able to relate to everything. Particularly when you have guys like this who take kind of the contrarian point of view on most things. This guy had a regular IGN column back in the day called Contrarian Quarter. He was very critical of games, beloved popular games like Dark Souls and Red Dead Redemption, that there's a huge fan base out there, but those games aren't for everybody. Just like Uncharted 4 won't be for everybody. And, you know, assigning a number to a review is just as arbitrary as it was back when Siskel and Ebert were doing it for movies, when it was 2 thumbs up or whatever metric you want. On our site, we decided to go for a 5-star system. Some people decided to go for a 10-point system based on graphics and sound and all these different equations and stuff. You know, Kotaku just reads like, should you play it? Yes or no. There's a number of layers and layers of systems, and just because somebody thinks it's a 10 out of 10 or 5 out of 10 or 7 out of 10, that's really more feedback for the developer and say like, well, this was a good game, but maybe you could go back and and fix this one thing about it. You know, it's not necessarily this game is automatically bad.
Absolutely. I could not agree more with what you said. Assigning review scores is really like a fool's errand. We try to create this illusion of objectivity, and then it creates this very weird scenario and a lot of just ridiculous and crazy internet arguments about semantics. For example, like let's say a reviewer gives a score to a casual game, a mobile game, assigns it a high score. Let's say we'll use Metacritic scale out of 100, like let's say a 90 or above. And meanwhile, that same critic might assign a lower score to a big budget AAA title on consoles, on PCs, on other platforms, and they might assign it a lower or average score. And all of a sudden, now there's this digging up of past review scores by the same reviewer, by the same outlet, and there's just all these unfair comparisons across the board. It just doesn't make sense. It's sort of a broken system, in my opinion. I think what really gets lost here is that you have to pay attention to the content of the review and who the reviewer is, and not necessarily a score that is assigned. More often than not, it's arbitrary. Metacritic is not an end-all, be-all. Yes, it's an aggregator of a lot of outlets out there, but there are a lot of irrelevant blogs that they take into effect on there. And I find it interesting that there are a lot of developers and publishers that take this into effect when assigning things like salary bonuses based on the overall review scores that they're given. It seems imperfect. It really does. And when you dive a little bit deeper, if you actually pay attention on Metacritic, there are outlets that refuse to assign scores deliberately. So it's just interesting that all of a sudden the Washington Post is really affecting this score in a negative way. It's currently the only score that's below an 80 using the Metacritic scale. So I think the lesson learned here is we really should be reading through reviews thoroughly and not just have this sort of gut reaction. And now this reviewer, in fact, is getting a lot of personal attacks on Twitter, and that's just uncalled for.
Right. We do want to have diverse opinions. I think it would be boring to think that we thought every game was awesome or every game was terrible. There are some 5 out of 10 games that I really, really enjoy, and no amount of criticism is really going to, prevent me from buying that game. It will help me get the game probably for cheaper because that's just how the broken system works. But, probably the most famous example of Metacritic really hurting game developers was Fallout New Vegas. If you remember that the Bethesda attached the Metacritic score to the publisher's bonuses, and they missed it by 1 point. They missed out on something. I think the story was something like $50,000, and that's really crazy. It's an arbitrary metric, very subjective. Your experience may vary depending on the kind of game environment, depending on multiplayer servers. In some cases, it might be, if you're working on a review of a PC game, it might be based on your hardware. It has all these factors into account that are going to be very variable between gamers. And I think the other thing too we have to think about is that standards change with games over time. Even with Uncharted, let's say, the very first Uncharted game was kind of an interesting game and probably rated very highly, but a 9 in 1999 is very different than a 9 in 2003 or 2007 or 2016. If we're comparing Uncharted games, I would say probably 2 is the high point. I haven't played Uncharted 4. Maybe it is the best of the series. Who knows? But I remember this controversy getting dug up back with Assassin's Creed 2 and Jim Sterling, who used to work for Destructoid, and people were like, "Oh my God, this guy hates Assassin's Creed." And when we look back on it, that whole argument was so silly because Assassin's Creed 2 is not worth having an argument about. There are better Assassin's Creed games. In fact, they made one not too long after that, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. Come on, if you do not like an Uncharted game, there are more games like that you can play. Check out that Rise of the Tomb Raider. There's so many games under the sun that appeal to so many different audiences that you can move on. Why come to the pitchfork defense of every single game if it doesn't get the perfect score that you were looking for?
Yeah, really well said. And just as a disclaimer, just to point out that neither of us have played Uncharted 4 yet, so we can't come to a definitive conclusion, be like, I totally disagree with this review at all. But at the same time, I think we have to say that there's value in reviews and reviewers. It's to protect the consumer from playing something that's not worthwhile, right? That might be dull or repetitive or unsupported by the multiplayer community. Things like that might be technically broken. So we're not advocating that reviews should go away altogether. there is a reason why I think it's important to have these, but these semantic arguments about scores and assigning numbers, it's just not worthwhile. So on that note, let's go ahead and move on to our next story, which is Microsoft killing off their very experimental Project Spark.
Right. So if you remember, Taylor, Project Spark was this kind of creation tool that Microsoft put out on Xbox One. It was kind of built as like, kids can learn how to develop video games using this software, and whatever they build, there's going to be tutorials, and there's all these like content systems that we're going to build into it, and eventually it'll kind of roll out into this bigger platform for new games and to increase the interest for younger people. And Microsoft killed support for it as of last Friday. They're no longer selling Project Spark, and they're discontinuing online services for the game in August. Let me just read you the quote here specifically from community manager Thomas Gratz. He said, quote, "Without services, players will no longer be able to download user-generated content or upload their own creations. If you want to access this content offline, you will need to download this content prior to August 12th. And it just seems like this was one of these like Little Big Planet Minecraft style moves by Microsoft that just didn't really get anywhere.
Yeah, and they even put out like a retail copy of this game, and Microsoft is also saying that if you bought this, you're going to get credit added to your Microsoft account. So I'm not sure what it retailed for specifically, but it's possible that there just wasn't an audience for this kind of thing. And you mentioned the other competition. You have Little Big Planet, you have Minecraft out there, and I think that Microsoft, they missed their opportunity here to really market this thing. And if you remember, we didn't really hear about Project Spark too often. And now it's gone, so it is what it is, and neither of us played it, so I don't know if we could talk about it that much more. All right, let's go on to our third and final story in this segment. A Fallout 4 player totally leaked upcoming DLC, and it got immediately shut down by Bethesda, but not before it did a lot of damage. So we're talking about this upcoming DLC that's actually being released tomorrow. That's Thursday, May 19th. It's called Far Harbor. This Far Harbor is very story heavy. Apparently, it's about taking on a new case with one of your companions, Nick Valentine, one of my favorites from that game. And so there are a ton of spoilers ahead of this, and the entire DLC was uploaded not only as torrents, but also to this mod hub site called Nexus. And then Bethesda's lawyers got involved, and it's been totally ugly. Ryan, is this the end of developers and publishers supporting the mod community?
Absolutely not. This happened because Bethesda allowed some Fallout 4 players to be part of a closed beta. It's certainly not going to be the end of closed public betas or open public betas. Blizzard last week said that over 10 million people played the Overwatch beta because it was free and it was public, it was open. It's kind of both a marketing bullet point and also a way to test server load. I think the same case is true with Fallout 4. That game was very buggy at release, and so Bethesda is trying to take this approach of, well, maybe we can release this partially to some users who are interested in playing this DLC, maybe a little bit early, and maybe they'll give us some critical feedback about bugs and stuff. And it's interesting because anybody who participated in this closed beta technically signed a non-disclosure agreement and signed a release saying that they wouldn't release this, they wouldn't talk about this with their friends or family, and somebody obviously broke that, and who knows if Bethesda will go after the person who released it. But the kind of damage that we're talking about here is apparently just about 800 people downloaded this mod from that Nexus website, and this DLC is going to be selling for about $25. So if you do the quick napkin math on that, that's about $20,000 that Bethesda lost in revenue just because some people were able to get the Far Harbor DLC ahead of time. And who knows if they will be able to check Steam accounts on the back end to see if people are playing this without having purchased it, and maybe they'll ban those users from Steam, or maybe lock them out of playing Fallout 4. But, I'm surprised that more of this stuff hasn't happened. The mod scene is always very, very interesting. It's this kind of weird experimental Wild West out there. And when Bethesda goes ahead and says, like, okay, we're going to support mods on consoles. Oh, we're going to go ahead and open up the floodgates for all of our games to have more mod support. This is the kind of thing that makes them wonder whether they should do that at all in the first place, or if it's going to continue to be this unregulated stream of consciousness.
Well, and if you look at this scenario and you look at something like XCOM 2, right? If you look at Firaxis, I remember going to PAX South earlier this year, and they had a panel where developers and modders were sitting side by side, and they had collaborated prior to release. So these were folks that had worked on the original XCOM, right? XCOM Enemy Unknown, and their mods were so popular that they decided that as a publisher, Firaxis was going to help work with them to put out some of their mods on day one for when XCOM 2 was released. And that seemed to be an overall positive experience. And that's a huge contrast from something like this, where we're talking about real money here. And when you were talking about that napkin math of a lost $20,000 in revenue, that's not including things like uploaded torrents. I'm sure these mods are going to be mirrored elsewhere, not just on this mod hub, this Nexus site. In theory, they may be losing a lot more money that we're just not aware of. So I'm sure this is leaving a very sour taste in Bethesda's mouth. And rightfully so. These are developers who work on DLC, on very strong DLC historically out of them, on past games like on Oblivion and Skyrim and Fallout 3. They haven't always been home runs, but for the most part, we have to support games that have DLC that are well thought out, have hours of gameplay, are of a great value to the player. And I think Bethesda in general fits that bill. So this is kind of unfortunate. I feel very bad for them. Okay, enough about the news for this week. Let's go on to this week's new releases.
I love new releases.
Let's start off with Homefront: The Revolution for PC, PS4, and Xbox One. So for context, if you're not familiar with the Homefront franchise, the original one in 2011 was a new IP by THQ. Then it got bought out by Deep Silver. And there's this whole development sort of hell that went around with it. Anyway, game was severely delayed. This is the sequel to it. It's a first-person shooter about sort of Red Dawn scenario where North Korea is invading the United States. Story-wise, always seems like a lot of potential. I remember playing the first Homefront, and it was pretty average. I did not enjoy it at all, and the multiplayer scene was just completely dead. So this one so far, the game has been out, the reviews have come in, and it is not good so far.
Right. Homefront was the original Homefront was the game that started the meme, press X to mass grave. It was kind of what led to the Call of Duty, press X to pay respects. These like contextual actions that for these really serious moments, these really like weighted, heavy story moments. It's just like, come on, you can't like press X to hide in a mass grave. Like that's totally ridiculous. And in this game, this game takes place in Philadelphia. It's also an open world game, which the first Homefront was this kind of like directed first person shooter in an era when that kind of game was really popular. Games like Singularity were coming out, and Homefront was just one of those in a vast that were kind of released and instantly forgotten. It wasn't that it was abjectly bad, it was just very forgettable. And Homefront: The Revolution doesn't seem to be inspiring anything new out of this franchise. What a shame, because the premise is really, really good. And Deep Silver, these are the people behind Saints Row. That's a really good franchise from them. These are also the people who bring you Dead Island. That franchise has also had its ups and downs. And Homefront was the last game that THQ put out. It was the game that sunk THQ as a company. That and the U-Draw tablets. And it's just weird that this game is coming out against this backdrop of other better games like Doom that came out last week, or Overwatch that's going to be coming out in a few weeks. Games that both take the first-person shooter premise and kind of do new, interesting twists on it. And Homefront: The Revolution doesn't seem to be doing that for anybody. So,
yeah, I've said it before on the show, and I'll say it again. The first-person shooter genre is a very crowded space. It's very difficult to stand out. You have giants like Battlefield, you have Call of Duties out there, and when you're trying to introduce a new IP, it's very hard for that to stick. I wish Deep Silver the best. I wish they would stick to sort of the quirky and funny, like Saints Row style of games. Like it's just not working out with Homefront. It seems like we haven't played it yet, but based on the reviews, probably not worth it at all.
From what I've heard, there is a Time Splitters 2 Easter egg in which you can play that entire game within Homefront. So, Taylor, you were a huge fan of Time Splitters 2. That was one of those games that was kind of lost in that purchase of THQ from Deep Silver. Maybe you'll buy that just to play Time Splitters 2 again.
Yeah, a huge fan back then, but even I realized that they probably don't hold up well. They were essentially like Perfect Dark and GoldenEye clones that were reskinned for more modern consoles for those generations in the past. But yeah, that's kind of a really cool Easter egg that they've got in the game. Let's move on to Valkyria Chronicles Remastered for PS4. You know, Ryan, I know you really enjoyed this back on the PS3 when it was an exclusive. Now Sega is re-releasing this one as a remaster. This one's running at 1080p, 60 frames per second. I think Sega really saw the great fan reaction when they ported over the non-remastered version on PC. There was still an audience for that. And this time around, though, all the DLC has been bundled in this one. So it seems like a really, really good value if you did not play this game back on the PS3 or this port on PC.
Yeah, the port on PC has been on sale for a very long time. You can get that game probably for as cheap as $5 when it's on a sale. Valkyria Chronicles is one of these games that I think it was a cult classic in the truest sense. Very, very fun, very kind of stylized world. You play as this squad of soldiers who tries to change the tide of an entire war. And it's really, really kind of a fun game. It switches between kind of this tactical overall map view, and then when you control the individual soldier units, it kind of turns into this like third-person cover shooter. It's a very interesting game. It has a very interesting combat system. I highly recommend you check it out. Whether you play it on PC, PS3, or PS4 now. Really, really great game, and I'm so glad that Sega is doing a great service in remastering this game. It was such one of my favorite strategy games of the past decade.
I did a quick search about this game because, believe it or not, I actually pre-ordered it. I found it on a deal a while back, I believe, on Amazon. But I wanted to see what the reactions are to see if Valkyria Chronicles still holds up. And it seems like so. Jason Schreier of Kotaku posted an article reacting to this remastered version. And he pointed out that the graphics really weren't touched. And so the remaster, he said in a comment on his own blog post that the only difference between this PS4 version and the PS3 version is that it's 60 frames per second and 1080p. So it's been upscaled. Plus, with, like I said before, the DLC, and it's only $30 this time around. What you remember back then is what you're going to get this time around. No change to the art style or gameplay, really. It's
such a shame because Valkyria Chronicles, the first one, was such a great game, and then they released that really bad Valkyria Chronicles 2 PSP game. Not bad, but let's say repetitive gameplay-wise. Valkyria Chronicles 2 was not the cult classic that Valkyria Chronicles 1 was. And then on top of it, Sega released Valkyria Chronicles 3 only in Japan as a mobile game, and that was, a real shame that gamers in the West did not get the chance to play that game too. So hopefully this means that Sega is interested in putting out more Valkyria Chronicles games, and if people buy this remastered, maybe they will explore that option.
That's it for new game releases for this week. Let's move on to our new video game announcements.
Here comes a new challenger!
First one, and perhaps the most important one for us, Civilization 6 is going to come out later this year. It's due to arrive on October 21st on PC. This is the next entry in the very popular Sid Meier strategy franchise. Man, Ryan, I have not played a Civilization game since Civilization Revolution, Civ Rev, and I really, really enjoyed it. I can remember maybe 5 or 6 years ago just staying up all night just thinking, oh, one more turn. And Civilization, it's so engrossing and can be so addictive. What makes these kinds of games so irresistible?
Right. So Civilization kind of really got its wings with Civilization 4 a while ago. I think that was the game that kind of brought a lot of people into this game. You're right, it's a strategy game, but when we talk about strategy games, we're really talking about different kinds of strategy games, right? There's kind of like the turn-based Final Fantasy Tactics style, like where you control a small army and try to control individual units. When we talk about Civilization games, we're kind of talking a little bit more of the grand strategy genre, or the 4X genre as it's more commonly known, which the 4Xs are explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. These are games where you generally control a larger society or nation, and you try to dominate the world, or you try to win in one of several ways, either economically or militarily or socially or politically. And Civilization 5 was also super popular. Where this franchise kind of went off the rails was their last release, Beyond Earth, which was them trying to take the Civilization formula and trying to turn it into space. And that wasn't very receptive to fans of this genre. And Civilization 6 seems to be a return to form. In this new game, basically, cities are now going to be able to physically expand on the map. Units can be combined into a single tile, and there will be more multiplayer modes designed for players to finish a game in a single session. This is the game that really inspires people to lose entire weekends just with one more turn over and over and over again. I've lost sleep playing the Civilization games, and I think that really speaks to how addictive these games really can be. Civilization Revolution, the game that you're familiar with, was kind of the more simplified console version, but still very addictive. I remember you spending hours and hours playing that game on the 360, and they released even a sequel that wasn't as well received on mobile platforms, Civilization Revolution 2, but the core Civilization franchise is very, very popular on PC, and I'm so excited to see that there's going to be a new entry coming later this year.
Yeah, and coming so soon, so that's always a positive. All right, moving on to another new game announcement, Phoenix Wright. Next one here in the US is going to be called Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney Spirit of Justice. And if you remember, the last one on 3DS was an eShop-only downloadable title called Dual Destinies. There was not a retail cart of this game. I love the Phoenix Wright series. They did a fantastic port on mobile with the original DS trilogy. It was a fantastic port. My favorite in that series is the crossover title of Phoenix Wright versus Professor Layton on 3DS, which I highly, highly recommend. I love that sort of adventure story style of game that Phoenix Wright presents with the puzzle aspects of Professor Layton. It was an awesome, awesome blend. I love what Capcom did there with Level 5. So I'm always excited when a new title is announced in both of those series. So look out for that this September. Let's breeze through the rest of these new game announcements because we don't know many details about the rest of these. First one being Star Wars Battlefront 2, finally confirmed. It's going to feature content from the new movies, so that would be past Episode 6 in the Star Wars movies. EA did tease it earlier this year, so we kind of knew it was coming. Ryan even mentioned it on last week's show because it was so long rumored. All we know now is that there's going to be content from the new movies, but they didn't name specifically which ones outright. So the first Battlefront from last year just had content from the original Star Wars trilogy. Next, Luminous on phones. There are 2 titles that are coming out, puzzle games in English and Japanese. Coming out in Q2, one's called Puzzle and Music, which is a paid app, and it's going to be followed by a free-to-play Luminous Versus game in the fourth quarter of 2016. And finally, Yokai Watch 2 is going to come to the US on September 30th. It seems like Nintendo's experiment with Level 5, bringing the very popular Japanese franchise over here stateside, went over very well. Probably not on the same level as Pokemon with the kids, but it's going to come out this fall, along with a huge marketing and merchandise campaign. Yokai Watch 2, it says here, gives fans new areas to explore, more than 100 new yokai to befriend, and including some that are exclusive to their respective game versions. Ryan, you never played Yokai Watch 1, right?
No, I didn't, but it's kind of interesting that they're taking this in a Pokemon direction. There's going to be like a Pokemon Red Blue of Yokai Watch 2, one that's called Fleshy Souls, and the other one that's called Bony Spirits. And I'm just really interested to see if this yokai phenomenon will have the same effect that Pokemon does. Pokemon recently celebrated a huge anniversary. Those games are wildly popular, and yokai is wildly popular in Japan. I'm really curious to see if they're going to try to really make a go of it with Yokai Watch 2.
There's absolutely no way that it will ever match Pokemon. It's just, it's not going to happen. Let's move on to our GG segment for this week. GG brought to you by our friends at ggbutton.com. GG to indie dev Dreamloop Games. They made this PC game out on Steam called Stardust Galaxy Warriors. It's a side-scrolling 1-to-4 player shmup co-op game. And this one guy out there, he's a hemiplegic gamer, so that means he only has control on one side of his body. It seems like he can only play with just a mouse for movement and shooting. So if a game doesn't support that, he's unable to play them. So he reached out to them saying, this looks like a cool title out on Steam. I wish it had mouse movement. So Dreamloop Games, those devs, messaged him saying, hey, we just reprogrammed the controls in there, see how it works for you. And there was an overwhelming response because that gamer in question posted a review on Steam thanking them that they did this. It just took him asking and reaching out to the developer to program in these controls so he can enjoy it. And there was this very positive response on Reddit. And we have to applaud developers out there who can make their games more accessible. It's one of those things I think that's too often overlooked by many. And even though they released the game without that support, the fact that they accommodated someone who actively wanted to buy and play their game is something we should praise, for sure.
Absolutely. We talk about games with very difficult control schemes all the time. We talk about games that don't have colorblind modes. Games that aren't playable by people who can see or hear. And, it's important that developers consider people who may not be part of their core audience, but are still interested in playing these games, that they try to make, their games playable by as many people as possible. So GG to this developer who really responded to fan feedback and gave a control scheme that made this player be able to play this game.
Yeah, this positive review on Steam says, somebody who would go out of their way like this unsolicited for a single potential customer, you can't beat that. The developer went on to post about this viral review that went out and reacted to it, saying, what did we learn? We learned that a few moments in the life of an indie developer can make the trials and tribulations of game development fall away, even if only for a while. But those moments are because of you, the gamer. And he goes on to say that we learned that amazing things can happen if you listen to fans, work hard, and believe. Especially if I'm inserting this final part here. This is not something they wrote on the Reddit post. Especially when you're supporting those with disabilities. They certainly got my support. I'm adding their game to the wish list. It's currently $10 on Steam. So GG, good game to Dreamloop Games. Let's finish this episode up. Ryan, you ready for the bonus stage?
Bonus soda.
Oh my god.
It's a Soda Drinker Pro. Don't you play video games?
No, not at all. Never.
Okay.
Nintendo President Tatsumi Kimishima told a Japanese newspaper that the company was looking into producing its own films for the first time, instead of just licensing out their characters. He said that they were currently looking at different studios around the world to partner with over the next few years, but there's no word on which characters are going to make the leap to film. But he did say Nintendo is not considering live-action films.
Well, thank God, because Nintendo just didn't learn their lesson with the original bad video game movie, Super Mario Bros. Maybe this is their shot at redemption. Speaking of video game movies, earlier this week, it was announced that a Tetris movie is being developed via a new company formed in partnership between the producer of such movie classics as True Lies and Mortal Kombat, and a Chinese production company. The press release says Tetris is going to be a trilogy of movies and a, quote, sci-fi thriller.
The headline by the futurist blog IO9 that put this out there is awesome. It says, Tetris is going to be a movie trilogy and someone needs to stop this shit immediately. We all know how Pixels went. Enough ruining classic IPs, please. Chelsea Monroe Castle, the author of the official Game of Thrones cookbook, is publishing the World of Warcraft, the official cookbook. It's coming out this October. Some of the recipes actually look awesome so far, I have to say, like Dragon Breath Chili, Cherry Grog, and Cinnamon Bun-like Lilac Claws.
There are a lot of WoW in-game cooking recipes, and I wonder if she'll cover them in the cookbook. It could take you a long time to cook all that, and you won't even grind much XP out of it.
That's it for this week's episode. If you liked our show, please subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes and Stitcher. Please let us know what you think.
You can also listen to us on Google Play Music, TuneIn, Clamor, or our site, 1pvs2p.com, or search for us using your favorite podcast app. All of our sources for this week's episode have been posted at the link in the show notes.
As always, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at 1pvs2p_podcast. Also, check us out on YouTube and Twitch, twitch.tv/1pvs2p_podcast. We haven't been active there lately, but we promise we're going to be making more gameplay videos, Let's Plays, and more. As always, we want to thank Phonetic Hero for the use of his songs for our show, Coffee Stomp, and Super Manly Brothers X. Both are part of the compilation project Chiptunes Equals Win.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Let's play more video games together.
See you next week.
Bonus soda.